We have never recovered a single piece of the first human clothing, not one thread, not one stitch, not one fragment of hide. Everything decayed. And yet we know, within a datable range, exactly when our ancestors started wearing clothes. The answer did not come from fabric. It came from lice. That date doesn't just tell us when humans got dressed. It tells us the moment our ancestors chose to survive somewhere the human body was never built to go. And the date is far earlier than most accounts allow. What remains in the record are 6 shadows the clothing left behind, each one a different type of evidence from a different place across hundreds of thousands of years. What does the shadow clothing left behind tell us about the mind that was already operating when the first garment was made? There is no fabric from the deep human past. Nothing older than roughly 10,000 years has survived in any burial or cave site on the planet. Not one thread, not one preserved seam. The first garments were almost certainly animal hide, and hide rots within decades in most soil conditions. If the physical object is gone, the only way to date clothing is to find something that depended on it. Researchers turn to something that lives on us, specifically inside our clothing: body lice. By sequencing the DNA of both head lice and body lice, geneticists calculated the point at which the two populations split into distinct species, because that split only happens once a new habitat exists long enough for a separate lineage to establish itself. The range across multiple studies lands between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago, clustering toward the older end. But a date range is not an explanation. Knowing when body lice split from head lice tells you when clothing became a daily habit. It does not tell you what forced that habit into existence. Humans had been walking the African continent for hundreds of thousands of years without it, with the same anatomy, the same basic environment, and the same prey animals available to hunt, and skin. Something changed, but the lice divergence date alone cannot identify what. The intuition is that cold drove clothing, that humans moved into colder climates and needed protection. But the date range sits well before the major human migrations out of Africa into Europe and Asia. At 83,000 to 170,000 years ago, most populations were still in Africa. So why were people in Africa wearing skins at all during that period? What was cold enough in Africa to require it? The answer sits in the climate record. The period between roughly 130,000 and 190,000 years ago is called Marine Isotope Stage 6, one of the coldest sustained stretches of the last 300,000 years. Africa, during that window, was not the warm, stable cradle the textbook version implies. Temperatures dropped, rainfall patterns shifted, and populations in highland and southern regions would have experienced cold that bare skin simply could not manage. The lice divergence date lands inside that glacial window. The date is not a mystery. It is a consequence. A cold period severe enough that the warmth of Africa stopped being reliable forced early humans to wrap themselves in the skins of animals they were already hunting, consistently enough and long enough that an entirely new species of parasite evolved to live exclusively inside those garments. That is not occasional use, it is dependence. And the lice are not just a dating mechanism, they are the biological record of the moment clothing crossed from option to requirement, and that crossing is measurable. The lice give us the date clothing became a daily habit. But if clothing was that essential, daily, dateable, life or death, then someone had to make it. Making a wearable skin is not simple, and the tools required to do it are still in the record. The oldest ones push the story back far further than the lice date does, and the distance between the two dates opens a question the lice alone can't answer. Making a wearable garment from an animal skin requires a specific first step that has nothing to do with sewing. The inside of a fresh hide is layered with membrane, fat, and connective tissue. Leave it in place and the skin stiffens as it dries, cracks under cold, and rots from the inside out. It has to be scraped clean before it becomes anything workable. Hide scrapers, small stone tools with a precisely angled bevel along the working edge, appear in the archaeological record at sites across Europe and the Middle East. Found in layers dated to several 100,000 years ago, in assemblages associated with human species that predate anatomically modern humans. The motion was already known long before we existed, but the tool is the same for all of them. The record shows the act, not the intent. But the scrapers predate the lice evidence by several 100,000 years, a gap longer than the entire existence of anatomically modern humans as a species, and that gap does not come with an explanation. The biological signal from lice tells us clothing became habitual somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. But hide processing capability was present hundreds of thousands of years before that date. What was the hide being prepared for during all that intervening time, if clothing dependence did not develop until so much later? And why, once the capability existed, did it take that long for daily clothing use to follow? The gap itself is what resolves the question. The scrapers confirm the capability to process hide into something wearable existed hundreds of thousands of years before any biological signal of clothing habit appears. Early humans knew how to work a skin. That knowledge was present, practiced, and passed across generations long before the glacial cold arrived. The glacial period did not generate the skill. It generated the daily demand for it. The knowledge had been accumulating quietly, applied to other purposes, waiting for a pressure point that made clothing the only option. When that pressure point came, the response was not invention, it was application. Something already known became something urgently necessary. The scrapers collapsed the picture of clothing as a sudden discovery at a datable moment, because the moment was not a beginning. It was a deployment of capability that was already ancient by the time anyone needed to stay warm. The scrapers tell us the capability was ancient, but capability is not the same as craft. Somewhere between a draped hide and a sewn garment lies a single invention that changed where humans could survive on this planet. And the cave it came from is not a neutral location. In the Altai Mountains of Siberia, inside a cave system called Denisova, excavators recovered a needle carved from the fibula of a bird, approximately 7 centimeters long, with a hole bored cleanly through the narrow end, small enough that the thread it carried would have been fine and tightly twisted. The needle dates to approximately 50,000 years ago. Producing that eye without splitting the bone requires a rotational drilling technique applied under controlled, even pressure. No accidental version of it exists, and no shortcut produces a clean result at that scale. Whoever made this object had failed at it before and learned from the failure. The finished needle was competent in a way that only comes from practice. An eye threaded with fine cord makes fitted construction possible. Garments shaped to close at the wrist, the collar, the waist, rather than simply draped and held. What changes with a fitted garment is not just comfort. A sewn seam traps a layer of warm air against the body that an open drape cannot maintain. And in the environments human populations were moving into at this period, the thermal difference is the difference between surviving a winter or not. But here is what the timing cannot settle. The needle appears in the record just before the documented expansion of human populations into Arctic conditions, where winter temperatures drop low enough to be lethal without insulation. That sequence is in the stratigraphy. What the stratigraphy cannot answer is whether the needle was made in preparation for those environments or developed in response to them once cold was already being encountered. And underneath that question sits a harder one. The cave where the needle was found is not a site associated only with modern humans. That fact changes what the needle might mean entirely. The needle was found in Denisova Cave, the same site where a fragment of finger bone yielded the first confirmed DNA from the Denisovans, a human population genetically distinct from both Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans, who ranged across Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived in that region. The stratigraphic layer the needle comes from has been associated with Denisovan occupation, though that attribution has been debated in subsequent literature and the dating of the specific layer has been challenged. The uncertainty is real and should be stated, but if the association holds, the implication changes the credit line on fitted clothing entirely. Modern humans did not necessarily originate this technology. A separate human lineage may have built it first, and modern humans moving through that region may have encountered it, learned it, or absorbed it from people they met, and then outlasted. The needle does not just change the date of fitted clothing. It opens the question of what else we inherited from populations we only recently learned existed, known first from a finger bone, confirmed by DNA, and now possibly credited with the invention of the sewn garment. The needle tells us fitted clothing existed 50,000 years ago. But around 25,000 years ago, something appears in the record that changes what clothing was, not just a survival tool, but something people carved onto ritual objects as a permanent image of themselves. What those objects are showing is the problem. Between 25,000 and 30,000 years ago, small carved figurines began appearing across a wide band of Europe and Western Asia, ivory, limestone, and bone, most of them depicting female figures. A specific group, recovered at sites including Gagarino and Kostenki in Russia, and Les Pouget in France, show something that gets less attention than the figurines themselves: clothing. Not bare skin or a generic wrap. Carved hats with defined brims, a belt sitting at the natural waist, a skirt with a fringe cut at the hem. At the scale these figurines were carved, adding a hat brim or a fringe required deliberate effort that served no structural purpose in the object itself. Someone put them there because they required deliberate effort at that scale. The problem is that woven fiber does not survive from 25,000 years ago. No textile from that period has been physically recovered. So the question is direct. Are those figurines showing garments that existed, or are they showing something imagined? But woven fiber does not survive from 25,000 years ago. Not a single piece of textile from that period has been physically recovered anywhere. The conditions that preserve bone and fired clay do not preserve organic fiber over that timescale. So the figurines present a direct evidentiary problem. They appear to show constructed garments, but no constructed garment from the same period exists to confirm that what the carvers depicted was real rather than imagined. And if the garments were real, the implications go further than clothing history. Weaving is not a simple technique. It requires specific materials prepared in advance, a structure to maintain tension across the work, and a sequence of steps that produces the interlace. It is not discovered accidentally. A figure carved wearing a hat with a brim implies a maker who had seen one. But the physical object is gone, and the figurine alone is not enough to prove it. The resolution does not come from the figurines. It comes from fired clay. At the Pavlovian sites, Pavlov and Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, studied extensively by researcher Olga Sofer, clay fragments were recovered bearing impressions of woven fiber pressed into the wet clay before firing. The clay survived, the fabric did not. What remains is the negative space of the weave, its exact geometry, preserved in the fired surface, repeated consistently across multiple fragments from multiple locations. The clay confirms that woven textile production was real, consistent, and established at the same period and location as the figurines. The figurines, therefore, are not artistic invention. They are record. By 25,000 years ago, what you wore was being documented on carved objects and replicated across a regional industry, which means clothing had crossed from survival necessity into something people considered worth preserving as a permanent image of themselves. The figurines tell us clothing was being recorded as identity, but there is a clue sitting in the record older than the figurines, older than the needle, and older in some cases than the lice date itself. And what it was doing changes what we thought the first clothing was for. At Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa, archaeologists recovered 2 abalone shells dating to approximately 100,000 years ago. Inside each shell was ochre, ground to a fine powder, mixed with crushed bone and animal fat into a workable paste. The shells are small enough to hold in one hand, and the mixture inside had been prepared through a multi-step process. Separate ingredients, combined in a specific order, processed to a consistent texture. Ochre is iron-rich mineral pigment, ranging from yellow to deep red depending on iron oxide concentration. The Blombos paste was red. Someone chose it, ground it, and blended it into something that could be applied to a surface and would hold there. But the Blombos record does not tell us what the paste was applied to. Ochre work directly into skin breaks down within days. Sweat and physical contact degrade it too fast for the preparation method to make sense if skin was the target. A fat-bound pigment ground to consistent fineness behaves differently on hide, penetrating the fibers and holding under sustained use and handling. The chemistry of the Blombos paste is more consistent with a surface that needed to retain color over time than with one that renews itself continuously. But the layer at Blombos does not separate the two surfaces. The shells are there, the paste is there, what it was pressed against is not attested in the same deposit. The question is whether choosing a color for what you wear is a survival act or something else entirely. What the Blombos kits resolve is not a question about pigment. They resolve the question of when the body, and what covered it, became a surface for communication. The answer is 100,000 years ago, earlier than the figurines, earlier than the needle, inside the range of the lice date itself. Someone at Blombos was grinding a mineral to a consistent powder, blending it with fat, to make it adhere to a surface that needed to hold color under use. And that is not a survival act. It is a deliberate choice about appearance. Whether the paste went onto skin or onto hide, the underlying decision is the same. This surface will carry a message to other people. 100,000 years ago, what early humans put on their bodies was already being used to signal something. Status, group identity, membership, to anyone who could see them. The date is 100,000 years ago, and that is not a theory. The shells, the ochre, the fat, and the grinding stones are in the layer, and the layer is dated. 6 tells, 6 different sites, 6 different types of evidence, from South Africa to Siberia to Central Europe, produced by populations with no contact and no shared culture. Put them in front of you at once and something appears that the standard account doesn't predict. Place the 6 finds in front of you. Lice DNA from living human genomes, pointing to a divergence between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. Scrapers from sites in Europe and the Middle East, several 100,000 years old, used on animal hide by human species that predate us. A bird bone needle from Denisova Cave in Siberia. 50,000 years old, with a bored eye small enough for fine thread. Clay fragments from Pavlov and Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, bearing the pressed geometry of woven fiber fired into permanence 27,000 years ago. Carved figurines from Russia and France, 25,000 to 30,000 years old, depicting garments with constructed detail. Ochre processing kits from Blombos Cave in South Africa, 100,000 years old, prepared for application to a surface that needed to hold color. 3 continents, 6 categories of evidence. No shared culture between the populations that produced any of them. No trade route connecting South Africa to Siberia. No contact between the people who fired that Czech clay and the people who ground ochre into a shell. But none of these finds are the clothing itself. Every piece of direct physical evidence has decayed. The hide, the fiber, the thread, the garments worn by the people who made every object in this list. What remains is the shadow the clothing left in other materials. And that shadow carries one question it cannot cleanly answer. The needle at Denisova Cave predates the arrival of anatomically modern humans at that site. If the stratigraphic association between the needle and the Denisovan layer holds under current dating, and that association is contested in the literature, then fitted clothing technology was already present in that cave before modern humans arrived. Whether they encountered it, absorbed it, or independently arrived at the same solution is not something the current evidence resolves. That question is open, and it has not closed. Here is what the convergence establishes, without overclaiming. Clothing did not appear as a single invention at a single moment in a single place. It appeared as a cascade, capability first, daily habit second, fitted construction third, identity fourth, deliberate signal fifth. Each stage built on the previous one, across hundreds of thousands of years, by populations with no contact and no shared material culture. South Africa to Siberia to Central Europe. The same behavior, the same progression, appearing independently across the full geographic range of early human expansion. That pattern is measurable. The explanation for it is not yet settled, and that is the honest position. The nested question closes the same way. The needle at Denisova Cave predates the arrival of anatomically modern humans at that site. Whether Denisovans built fitted clothing first, whether the technology passed from one population to another, or whether modern humans arrived at the same solution independently, the stratigraphy does not give a clean answer. That is not a failure of the evidence. That is the live state of the field, and stating it honestly is the only defensible close. What the 6 tells do establish is a profile, not a timeline of invention, but a profile of a type of mind, one that plans past immediate need, invests labor in objects that communicate rather than just function, and records what it wears on carved surfaces as if appearance is part of identity. That profile is traceable across 3 continents, 6 different categories of physical evidence, and a span of time that begins long before the moment most standard accounts point to when they say the modern human mind switched on. The clothes are gone. The profile they left is not. That mind is yours, not metaphorically, measurably. The capacity to choose a color for what you wear, to invest hours in a tool that makes a garment fit rather than just cover, to record what you wear as part of who you are. None of that appears for the first time in the recent record. It appears inside the periods this video just covered. Fully formed, already running. The person grinding ochre into an abalone shell 100,000 years ago was not doing it because they were cold. They were doing it because other people would see them. That is the same operation you performed this morning. The materials are different. The mechanism is identical, and its age is measurable. You did not develop this capacity. You inherited it from people who were already using it before the last ice age ended. The clothes are gone. The inheritance is not. If 6 pieces of indirect evidence just move the date you'd place on the modern human mind, that is exactly the feeling this channel is built for. Subscribe. Next episode, a burial from 34,000 years ago in Russia, where a single grave held 13,000 hand-carved ivory beads, each one taking approximately an hour to make. Someone gave 13,000 hours to a person who was already dead. We're going to work out what that means.